Hi guys, are you worried because that new to you old two-stroke snowmobile is leaking oil out of the exhaust? Well, that's a serious problem. Or it's nothing to worry about. One or the other. So I do get the odd question from time to time about oil dripping out of the exhaust on a two-stroke snowmobile like this. But once again, guys, I'm not a mechanic. I'm a nerd with a sled. If you're not sure what's going on with your sled, you should always take it to a qualified technician. But I have had a little bit of experience with oil dripping out of the exhaust on this 670, as I mentioned. So in this video, I'm going to give you my top 10 reasons why oil might drip out of your exhaust. Now, a little bit of oil dripping out of your exhaust is fairly normal, or at least it's pretty consistent with what I've seen with this older sled. So if you stick around to the end of the video, I'm going to do a cold start on this machine. It's been sitting for a while, and I'll show you what I typically see under the exhaust. I want to pull the old fuel out of both machines because you got to remember that I didn't ride very much last year, so I certainly didn't use a full tank of gas. So there's fuel that's been sitting in these machines for like 2 years now. So I'm going to pull that old fuel out and put fresh stuff back in. Now, the reason that I mentioned the gas is that that is one thing that can have a bearing on this particular problem, and we'll get to that shortly. So I'm going to have to look at this guy's name. It was a little bit long. I tried to remember it and I've forgotten it already. So NWO Sledding RMK 8007 asked, what about oil spitting out of the exhaust? I've got a Polaris switchback that keeps spitting oil on the ground, played with the oil pump, but keeps doing it, and it sputters at half throttle. So there's a couple of clues in there, but I'm going to go through the whole shooting match, everything that I think may cause this to happen. So in no particular order, starting with number 10, storage. When your sled sits for a long time, oil will drain. It will drip down off the cylinder walls into your exhaust through the exhaust port. Older machines will have check valves that don't work as well as they did when they were new. The rotary valve on this old 670, those things will leak a little bit in a way that might not bother you when you're riding, but when it's sitting over time, oil will get into the engine. And that does make sense if you think about it, right? If you're getting a little bit older and you've been sitting here long enough, there'll be a little puddle under you too. Number 9 we'll call garage starts. So you start the sled up and then you shut it down without ever really running it. You don't take it out for a rip and get it hot. You just start it and shut it down. So maybe you're getting it out of storage, or maybe you're problem solving something. Maybe you just want to play with it. But when you start and stop like that, what will happen is because the sled's not getting up to temperature, you're not getting it hot, you'll get some of that fuel won't burn completely. It'll pass through that cylinder and collect in your pipe. So stop playing with it or you'll go blind. Okay, number 8 is a sticking choke. Now, I've never had that problem. This machine has a primer and that machine's fuel injected. But if your choke is sticking, you're not going to get enough air. You're going to get too much fuel and oil. Number 7, if you have a carbureted sled, it might be set a little bit on the rich side. So the air mixture screw might be favoring fuel oil a little bit too much. Number 6 is your fuel pump. And that might sound counterintuitive because you think if the fuel pump's not working, you're not going to get enough fuel. But it helps if you understand how the fuel pump works on your sled. So a lot of these old sleds have a vacuum type fuel pump that is driven by the pressure vacuum differential that's created by the pistons. So that pump has two halves separated by a diaphragm. On one side, you've got fuel coming in from the fuel tank and out to the carbs. And on the other side, you've got the vacuum. It's a pulse line from your crankcase. So the way it works, the pressure and the vacuum and the pulse line move the diaphragm. That pumps the fuel to your carb. What'll happen eventually is that diaphragm can get weak or brittle and it doesn't work as well. You don't get enough fuel. But you can also get a hole or a tear in that diaphragm. Then the fuel gets sucked through that diaphragm, ends up traveling through the pulse line into your crankcase. So how common is that? Well, on a newer sled during its service life, probably not very. I talked to someone I know with a dealership who fixes sleds for a living, and he said he almost never replaced a fuel pump. On the flip side, a lot of the people watching my channel have older sleds like this one. So while the part may be fairly reliable, this sled's like 28 years old. So over that amount of time, the materials in it can start to break down. There are some older sleds that don't have a fuel pump. They just rely on gravity to get the fuel to the carbs. This is where the fuel pump is on my sled. If you're not sure where yours is, just follow the lines back from the carburetor. Okay, now this 2005 Rev is fuel injected, and underneath the seat, I've got an electric fuel pump right in the tank. Number 5, a sticking needle and seat in your carburetor. And if you watch my sled flooding video, a lot of these things are touched on. This one is covered in more detail. But if you look under your sled and you see a black oily puddle, you're going to think it's leaking oil. With your car, that's usually what it is. Two-stroke sled, it probably is fuel and oil that's building up in the exhaust and leaking out. If it's the needle and seat, Even overnight while the sled is sitting, it can flood out. Your crankcase can get loaded up. Then you pull it out in the morning. You try and start it. It's going to be hard starting. And you're going to see that little black puddle under the exhaust. Number 4, oil pump. And I don't think it's the culprit in the majority of these cases, but there's a couple of things that can happen with them. So your oil pump, most sleds will have a variable rate oil pump, draws oil from a reservoir and injects it into the motor. The more throttle you give the machine, the more oil it's getting. So a couple of things that can happen. One is the adjustment can be out of whack, and that's normally a matter of adjusting the amount of slack in the cable. So you need a service manual, give you more information about that. The other problem, I know with this rev, for example, it can be a problem. There's a little armature the cable hooks onto, and it doesn't always return fully when you let go of the throttle. So the last couple of items are anything that can contribute to an inefficient or incomplete combustion of the charge in the cylinder. So for number 3, I'm going to clump 2 together. I'm going to say piston rings and crank seals. So the bigger things in the motor that may require an actual rebuild. So the thing with those that you need to remember is that I find typically when I get online and ask a question about my sled, anything, people start with, oh, it's your crank seals, right? And you know what, it may be, okay? But those are the most work to correct. So there's a lot of other things that will cause this problem that we want to rule out first. Now you could be due for a top end rebuild because worn out piston rings definitely can contribute to this problem. And a good place to start with that one is a simple compression test. Number 2 is an incorrect or damaged spark plug. So if you've got a plug in there, it's been in there for a while, it's not firing properly. Again, that fuel air mixture is not going to ignite. It's going to move through the cylinder, collect in the exhaust, and Bob's your uncle. And you know, not just spark plugs, you could say anything that results in a weak spark, things like wires and coils. And the number one reason why you may have poor combustion, bad performance, oil and gas leaking out of your exhaust, old stale gas. And that's something I freely admit doing myself. And it's stupid because it takes a couple of minutes to put some stabilizer in it. But yeah, I've had a couple of years where I just put them in here. I had a lot going on. This was the last thing on my mind. Put them in here, covered them up, forgot about them. And trust me, old stale fuel will make a big difference in how your sled runs, right? It's gonna run boggy when you give it fuel. You're gonna see black on the snow. You're gonna see oil dripping out of the pipe. So especially if you've just bought your sled, remember the guy who sold it to you probably hasn't been riding it either. It's probably been sitting there. So any of those can cause extra fuel and oil to build up in the exhaust. And any of them could make it sputter when you give it throttle if the spark plugs are getting wet. All right, let's pull this thing out and see if it'll start. So I put a paper bag under it. I let it run for maybe 2 minutes to get warm. Then I took it for a little rip around the village, put it back away and put the bag underneath. You're seeing about this much oil under it. So a fairly small amount. It's hard to tell because even on the paper it soaks in and spreads out. So really it's going to come down to how much is it. If it's a teaspoon or two, you got some drops in the snow, it's probably normal. It's probably moisture and gas and carbon and oil and about what you'd expect to see under a 28-year-old sled. All right, I think I'm gonna call that it for this video. So hopefully then that will put your mind at rest. And if it doesn't, it'll give you some ideas of the things you can look for to figure out why you've got oil coming out of your pipe. So if you like that video, do me a favor and hit that thumbs up. If you got anything to add or any ideas what might cause this, drop me a comment below. Otherwise, until next time, my name's David Clark. Thanks for taking the time to watch. Rich condition, or when the mixture on the shed. Okay, number 8 is a soap. That's 600. It had the wrong spark plug when I got. NWORM. Okay, I think that's it for this video. So NWO sledding. Okay, I think I'm gonna call that a wrap.